Take me to work. All right, today I'm going to do something that Claude suggested for our contracting business. What it said to do is it wants to get like a voice, like my voice, it wanted me to do audio files talking about certain things. And this one's going to be kind of the origin of the company and stuff, and it's going to take that information and create like a branding file, I guess, or a God, I can't even think of the word. It's like it's going to use it to basically create like our voice, the company voice on blogs and social media posts and all that stuff. So what I'm going to talk about today is basically the history of the company and how I got into the business and how my family got into the business. So my grandparents on my mom's side, they met during World War II. My mom's mom was originally born in England, and then they moved to Australia when she was very young. And then my grandfather was actually stationed in somehow he spent time in Australia and met my grandmother, and then after the war he came back to America, and then he ended up bringing her over, and they got married, and they had my mom, and she has a sister, and unfortunately my grandmother traveled back to Australia when my mom was pretty young, and she ended up passing away. She had a stroke after she landed, had a stroke and passed away in Australia. I think she was in her 40s. She was very young, so it's kind of sad. But my mom, she talked about her mom a little bit, and her dad was in her life. My grandfather was a custodian at a school in Blue Island, Illinois. Calumet City, Blue Island area. Now, my grandparents on my other side, Grandma Betty and Grandpa Clyde, I'm not sure how they met, but they were married for a while. They had 3 kids. My grandfather was like the postmaster of their small town. He was the postman. Kind of an ironic story. You always hear about the kid in the town who has red hair and the mailman has red hair kind of thing. Well, my grandfather's nickname was Red, and he was the postman, and he ended up leaving my grandmother for another woman in the town, and I guess it was a big controversy and really affected my dad. But so they split up when my dad was very young, and then he moved up into the Chicago area and to the Calumet City, Blue Island area. And then my parents met when they were in high school sweethearts. My dad went off to Vietnam for a year, came back. They ended up getting married. They moved from Blue Island up to Algonquin, Illinois. When they lived in Algonquin, my dad was actually he was a baggage handler for United Airlines at O'Hare Airport. So he worked like 3rd shift. And right across the street from where we lived, there was a VFW. My dad, being a veteran, would go there. And he started meeting people. And one guy had a van and a gutter machine that he wanted to sell. And he was selling my dad on what a great business it would be and all this other stuff. And it took about 2 or 3 months before my dad's finally like, well, let's try it. Maybe they saved up. So he ended up getting the gutter machine and the van, and he partnered up with my one uncle, and they started their little gutter business. And so during the day, my dad would sell and install the gutters, and at night, 3rd shift, he would work at the airport. And he did that for several years. I think 3 or 4 years. He did both jobs, and finally the gutter business was taking off, and he was able to quit his baggage handling job and just do the gutter thing. some point, I'm not sure, the uncle and my dad had kind of split off. My dad continued on with the business, and he built it up. It's funny, that same VFW where the guy sold him the gutter business basically, is where he used to park his trucks. He had one van that really didn't run, and he had one van that he used for the gutter machine and equipment and everything. And he would store material in the van that didn't run, and he'd run out with the other one. And it's a pretty interesting start. And he ended up building the business up, and it started becoming a little bit more successful. He ended up building a house like right down the road in Lake in the Hills, Illinois. He ended up general contracting the house and built the house, which is pretty impressive for someone who never built a house or done anything like that. And then he ended up, we lived there for several years, and they ended up buying some land in Crystal Lake, and then he built another house, which would eventually be the house that I grew up in, and my parents lived in for many years, in Crystal Lake. So that's how we got to Crystal Lake, and that was 1979 when he built the house. It was done, and we finally moved in. And originally, he just ran his little gutter business. He bought acreage. He bought I think it was 13 acres. It had a long driveway, and the house was set back. And then about halfway down, he had built a pole barn, and he ran the gutter business out of that pole barn. And he built it up pretty good. I mean, he got into working with major track builders and even custom builders and stuff like that. So he had a good reputation. One thing I learned from my dad was you do it right, you overdo it, and you over-deliver, and he just built a really good reputation in the business of taking care of things. And he had a ton of friends that were in the business. He was the type of guy that never spent a penny on marketing or appointments or leads or anything like that. He would basically go to the VFW, or he'd go to whatever bar, and his contractor buddies would be there, and then that's how he basically built this business, was out of the bar, and then connections and getting in with builders. And the big track builders were towards the end of him owning the business. The big track builders were the majority of the business, I would say, probably 75%. Anyways, the name of his company was Rainy Day Gutters, and started in 1974, and he built it up. I think at the height of it, he had probably 4 full-time gutter crews going in vans. In high school, I started working for my dad, just basically labor, helping out on jobs. And honestly, in the beginning there, it was more of, hey, take my kid out so he can earn some money kind of thing, because I probably was pretty worthless, to be honest with you. I was not handy with stuff. And then so through high school, I worked there on summers, and then I went away to college, and I would come back during the summer, and I would work all summer, and then I'd come back on breaks, and I'd work during breaks. And I think I got a little bit better, but I still wasn't, I think when I went out with these guys, it was more of a favor to my dad, it seemed like. But what was nice about that is I worked during the summers and breaks, and I didn't have to work at school, so, it kind of let me have the college experience without having to worry about, having a job and working. Graduated from college, ended up graduating college with a degree in psychology. My plan was to go to medical school. I ended up taking the MCAT, which is the medical school entrance kind of test, and didn't do very well. And I graduated with honors in psychology, though. And, you know, some of the science subjects, like biology, I did really well, but other things like organic chemistry and stuff, it was a weed out class, and it pretty much weeded me out. So anyways, I decided to take a year off from school, and that's kind of the joke, take a year off from school, because I never went back. My plan was to become a psychiatrist, go to medical school, become a psychiatrist, and I just started working for my dad. I was literally a gutter installer for my dad. And I started out like hourly, like a labor type position, and then I worked myself up to where I was getting a split. We would work on piecework, like how much work we did, we would get paid. And that's where I kind of got the, I guess that's the more entrepreneurial way of doing it, because as much as I produced, as I would make that much money. And so it was kind of funny. Once I started doing that, I was like, I want to earn more money. And I was working with a guy who was a little bit older. He wasn't really that ambitious. He just wanted to kind of do whatever, and I was pushing him. And super nice guy, but I was a little more ambitious than him on what I wanted to do and the money I wanted to make, so I was pushing him and whatever. So he ended up leaving, and I kind of took over as a crew leader, and yeah, I've trained a couple people, and I did stuff. 7 years I installed gutters, working for my dad. This was 1993 to about 2000. Never made more than $35,000 working for my dad, which, you know, whatever. So 2000, he ends up selling his company to a big conglomerate who was going around rolling up these companies that were dealing with these big builders, because that was the big business in the 90s and early 2000s, was the track builders. And so they were rolling up companies. They did insulation, they did these prefab fireplaces for the builders, and they got into gutters. And I ended up working for the new company. As part of the deal, he sold, I think my dad gave me like $5,000 with the sale. And then they took over the company, and then what they did is they split the company into two. One went and became a union shop, the other one stayed non-union. I went with the union one because I was like basically the sales rep for the big builders. I was there for like 2 years. Horrible experience. They were all about their GP, their gross profit. Gross profit, that's all they cared about. And it was so cutthroat, it was ridiculous. They had rolled up some other companies, this insulation company, and the guy who was running, so the company they bought, he stayed on to manage the branch, and he was just miserable. He was the nicest guy. Can't remember his name. So super nice, but you could tell he was miserable. He had like a 1 year deal where he had to stay there, and you know, 1 minute after that 1 year, he was gone because he hated it. And so I was rolled up into the branch with the union. And then when that guy left, they had this woman that was kind of leading the branch, right? She was the sales manager and kind of the branch manager a little bit. No, she was the sales manager. The guy who owned the insulation company was the branch manager. He left, and then they brought in this other guy, this corporate guy whose dad was a bigwig, and his brother was in the business. He was in the business. He comes in, and this is just an example of how cutthroat it was. So she's my sales manager, and she was doing the insulation on these big builders, and I was doing the gutter estimates on the big builders. And so we were kind of working together. As soon as the new manager came in, she brought me in her office, and she says, I am no longer going to be your sales manager. I am taking all of the accounts that we share, I'm taking the gutters and the insulation, and that was it. So I walked out of her office and I was just like kind of in shock, I checked out. I was like, I'm done. So I think I stayed there for about another 6 months. Like, I quiet quit before quiet quit was cool. But they never fired me. So I go in one day for a sales meeting, and the manager guy brings me in. He didn't like me, and he's this little short guy. And he's like, I don't even know what you do here. And I was like, he goes, I'm letting you go today. You're done. So I got canned from that job. Then I kind of floated around and tried to find other things to do. Nothing really sunk. And then I saw an ad in the paper for a gutter salesman. And I went and interviewed, and that's an interesting story. This guy, super heavy guy, long black hair and ponytail, one of those guys that are like, I don't know, like a character from a movie or something. He's like, if you drove to blah blah blah, it was like an hour and a half away, and you had a 50% chance to make $500, would you do it? And I'm like, sure, because I wasn't making any money. I was broke. I was kind of living with my girlfriend, and she was paying for everything. And so that's when I got introduced to in-home sales through this guy who was like an old tin man. He came from Louisiana. He sold siding and other things in Louisiana, and that's kind of like how I learned like the in-home sales. So I would say from my dad, I learned, quality, relationship, do the right thing. There's a lot of times that he had to eat a lot of cost because things got messed up, but he always would. And he always maintained the relationship, and all the guys he worked for or worked with, these other contractors, would refer him with no problem. I mean, they were all buddies, but they all trusted each other because they all did good work. And so when he was building the houses, he used all those guys. They were all buddies. But so I think I'm going to stop there for now. So I've got you from kind of family history to how Rainy Day Gutters started, to the end of Rainy Day Gutters, and a little bit past that. And I'll pick it up in the next one with, kind of post Rainy Day Gutters and how everything else started from there. So I'll see you tomorrow.